Yeah. Great. I won't say anything about
Yeah.
Whenever we like exams. Yeah. You want to take an example? Yeah. I'm leaving. I'm leaving.
Yeah, to fly with fly. Oh, you're not recording?
I think, yeah.
I don't think. No, I'm fine. I don't fine, but they didn't actually like one splash. That's okay. Sorry, I'm not a person. This is hard.
It's actually really easy. Given how we talk.
All right. How long that's gonna last? Yeah. All right, so let's get started. Let me remind you there is no lunchtime talk on Friday. The next lunchtime talk is next week on Tuesday. Megan Page is going to be talking about rules made to be broken, calibrating climate proxies, and we're looking forward to this talk. While there is no lunchtime talk on Friday, if you are interested, the Geography of Philosophy project is organizing its final conference, starting here on Thursday around 5:36 with a reception, then talk during the evening for our friends in Asia. And then on Thursday and Friday, talks during the whole day, including on Thursday evening, also for friends in Asia. So if you're interested, the program is online. You're all welcome to join us for this talk. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Devin Gouvea, who is a professor at the College of the Holy Cross, and right now she's a visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Science. Devin specializes in the philosophy of biology, but also general philosophy of science. I think we will hear a little bit about that today, but in particular with respect to the nature of scientific concepts. She got her PhD from the University of Chicago, and her dissertation was on essentially dynamic concepts and the case of homology. And she has published in Philosophy of Science, another journal, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Right. Thanks, Edouard. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So Ingo has already noted that I did a little bit of false advertising and changed the title on you, but hopefully you'll see why as we go through the talk. I think this is a slightly better title for what it is they want to talk about it, but you'll hear the other title later. So what I want to do to start is just share a little bit about the two big inspirations for this kind of ongoing project, a work in progress that I'm going to be presenting today. So first, as Edouard mentioned in my dissertation, I spent a lot of time studying historical disputes over the meaning of homology, this key biological concept that I'll come back to a little bit later in the talk. And I noticed something interesting as I was doing this. So there's a little philosophical literature on homology, and there's certain issues that philosophers writing in that literature assume are going to be the most important in driving disagreements or conflicts among the biologists using the concept. But then there were the issues that the biologists were actually arguing over when they were having arguments about the concept. And there were some really interesting differences between those two sets of issues. So I'm not going to talk about those differences now, that's other work. But I mentioned them because that's kind of what led me to step back and sort of think more carefully about what was actually driving the concept to change and vary over time, and whether something similar might be happening for other concepts. So that brings me to the second motivation. Meanwhile, as I'm working on this homology project, I was going to Phil Bio talks at the PSA, other conferences, paying attention to the literature, and it seemed like there was sort of an increasing number of conversations happening about multiple meanings, not just of homology, but of other concepts, especially in biology, but also in psychology and kind of beyond. So I started wondering, is there something more general going on here? Is there a way that we can get some broader insight into why concepts are often so dynamic in biology and other related fields that will also kind of respect the differences of the individual cases? So just to give some examples of that phenomenon I was talking about, species is probably the best known concept in biology, where it's very hard to pin down exactly what it means. If you ask a bunch of different biologists, you'll get different answers. Similar things happen though for concepts of gene, function, individual. I just have picked these examples because they have nice pictures, but you could find lots of other authors writing on each of these concepts. So here we get sort of a taxonomy of meanings of function. Here, this nice possibility space of things that could be individuals. A favorite example of mine coming from Pitt, Rose Novick's work on homology. And of course, Edouard's work on concept itself. And we could keep going. So even more examples. I'm not the only one to have noticed this trend. So here's another list of concepts from this paper by Taylor and Vickers in 2017. And they're noticing especially sort of the rise of what is called an eliminativism about these concepts, that people are more and more recognizing there's multiple different meanings. It doesn't seem like we're going to be able to fit them all together. Maybe what we really have is a bunch of different sub-concepts. That's kind of the roughly the eliminativist picture. That's one among a range of possible philosophical responses that you could have to the situation of variation or fragmentation or polyphemy. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail in the interest of time, and there's probably other taxonomies that could be drawn, but most of the categories here from this paper by Beckett Sterner and Samuel Cusimano on function, following some unpublished work by Joyce Havstad. So they've come up with kind of all of these categories with the stars, and then I've already mentioned eliminative pluralism, the idea that we have under this heading of a single term, several different concepts that should be separated, eliminating the heading term. And then also, I want to mention this sort of patchwork approach to concepts, building on work done by Mark Wilson, of course. So the core idea there is that there's sort of multiple different domains in which a concept is applied, and different things happen in the different domains, and they're connected in some careful ways by the scientists who are using them. So Philip Howes has a general explanation of this patchwork approach, but it's also been applied to homology in the work by Novick that I mentioned earlier, and to species. So looking at this kind of range of options, I'll just kind of step back and comment on what we see here. One obvious dimension of variation among these different philosophical responses is kind of this monism versus pluralism, right? Some of these things are labeled monism, some of them are labeled pluralism. That sounds like it should just be a simple distinction that hangs on the number of legitimate meanings that are recognized, but actually things get more complicated than that when you start looking at the details of these positions. So positions, monist positions, or at least positions labeled monism here, other than the hard monism, allow multiple legitimate meanings. So in that sense, they're kind of pluralist, but they're monist about sort of the structure, I would say, of the relationship that holds the different senses of the term together, or at least they insist on some greater unity than people that tend to call themselves pluralists. So I'm not sure that this distinction is as helpful as it seems like it should be on the surface. Another important dimension of variation that I wanted to mention is kind of how prescriptive these accounts are. In other words, how thoroughly do the philosophers propose to kind of rein in the excessive flexibility that scientists have when they're using their language. And that also can't necessarily be predicted from whether someone claims to be a monist or a pluralist. So obviously hard monism is pretty prescriptive. There's just one definition, one right definition with these necessary and sufficient conditions. Sorry, that's what I mean by NS there. But versions of fuzzy monism, or what's called fuzzy monism here, can actually be quite accommodating, allowing a lot of flexibility. Likewise, I take eliminative pluralism to be a fairly prescriptive form of pluralism, whereas sort of disjunctive or integrative pluralism might be sort of softer versions of this. Oh, and I should also mention integrative pluralism here, since we just had a talk referencing that. So this particular integrative pluralism is about concepts rather than the original framework that Sandy Mitchell has developed. So the idea is that the different senses of the concept might be needed for one particular case. So that again is going to be sort of inclusive and accepting the different things that scientists have, less prescriptive about how exactly they should be fitting them together. Okay. So looking at the big picture of those debates, I think it's fair to say that sort of these prescriptive approaches, maybe both the monist and the pluralist forms, have kind of maybe had a greater influence over the direction of the conversation. And it seems like the more flexible options are sometimes on the back foot. Maybe not always, but often. Often you see arguments of the form, well, we should be pluralists because monism fails in this, that, or the other way. Or we don't need to be eliminativists because it's not necessary in these, that, or the other circumstances. It's okay to keep the plurality of meanings around. So over time, I think the focus has shifted from monism to eliminativism as the kind of more prescriptive option. But still, I think the burden of proof seems to rest on people who want to keep things a bit messier in the conceptual sphere. So my project, like some of the others I've mentioned, like the patchwork approach in particular, I think is in some sense an attempt to kind of reclaim this high ground a little bit and say that we don't have to just defensively be advocating conceptual flexibility. Or maybe at this stage, I'll say I'm just kind of scouting out the high ground and seeing what the prospects are for sort of a more positive, assertive form of conceptual flexibility. So if it turns out to be the case, kind of trying to motivate this more positive stance, if it turns out to be the case that this polysemy or the semantic variation, the proliferation of meanings, is a natural result of certain pervasive features of good scientific language, successful scientific practice, even the objects of science themselves, then we have kind of a prima facie defense of this existence. If this is something that stems naturally from how science functions, then we would expect to see it. It's not a problem. It's in fact sort of the default state for a lot of scientific concepts. So then if it can sort of mount one defense or maybe multiple defenses of that idea, some of the energy that's sort of devoted to justifying polysemy could be instead diverted to understanding how it arises, what patterns it tends to take, what purposes it tends to serve. So I don't want to close off the possibility that sometimes it could be counterproductive. So people who advocate eliminativism will often say, all right, this diverts, people who are looking for the one underlying meaning of concept or function or whatever, or species, they're sort of wasting energy that could instead be focused on looking at separate problems, or they're just confusing things. They're talking past each other. Sometimes that might happen. I don't want to close off I don't want to say that polysemy is always and everywhere productive, but I think it's maybe productive and useful a lot more of the time than we tend to assume. So that's going to be my motivation for the project. So back to the title, I'm working to develop, as I say here, kind of a general model, I'm going to call it, of conceptual dynamics. I want to focus on two words in the title that kind of signal the approach I'm going to take. The first one is this word dynamics. So I've been talking so far about polysemy, or what we might also call semantic variation. So the existence of more than one meaning for a concept at some given point in time. We might sort of illustrate it like this, right? We have some axis of variation, and at a particular point in time, there's multiple flavors or varieties of a concept. And in the literature, we're trying to figure out what to do with it. But I think this kind of synchronic phenomenon is intimately linked with a diachronic process of conceptual change over time. So the messiness that we see in any particular point in time is kind of a recent slice of this extended process. And I think are going to need some of that historical perspective ultimately, both to recognize kind of the extent of this puzzle that we're dealing with. Like, why don't key scientific concepts converge over time as science progresses? If there is such a thing as scientific progress, we might expect that the concepts would kind of settle down in the way that certain research findings seem to settle down, but they don't. That's kind of an interesting general phenomenon. But I also think the history is helpful to give us clues in individual cases that might help us make sense of sort of this general pattern that we see. So I'm going to have there's going to be a historical dimension to this approach that I'm developing. The other key word in the title is modeling. And so here I'm trying to evoke mathematical models in fields like population genetics or economics or physics, where we're using some kind of formal tool to represent the interaction of different components of a system over time. Mathematical modeling is not my area of expertise, so I'd love to hear from people who work more closely with those models. But what I think I'm confident in saying that an advantage of these kinds of models is that there are a few advantages. One, we can focus not just on the outcomes, is this thing, in this case, is it polysemous or is it not, but also on the processes that produce them, on the different factors that are sort of interacting and the patterns and ways in which they interact. And I think those patterns in the case of concepts are likely philosophically interesting in their own right. Another thing that I take to be a benefit of this kind of modeling analogy is that models can be quite flexible. We can study a wide range of different outcomes with the same model. So depending on the strength, you might say, of the parameters or the different processes that are going into the model, you might get very different outcomes. And that's kind of a useful property for the thing that I'm trying to develop here. So I'd like to develop something that makes sense, not just of polysemous concepts, but of those that are more monosemous, stable, if such a thing exists in science. Okay, so that has done the first section of the talk. Here's the itinerary for what's coming next. I've given you the motivations, and now I want to kind of embark on this model building exercise. Then in the third section, I'm going to focus on this idea of an exemplar, which is kind of a key component of the model. So that'll make more sense once I've gotten through the second part. And then a brief little coda at the end, riffing on some interesting resonances I've seen between the stuff that I did and Thomas Kuhn's famous structure of scientific revolutions. Okay, so building the model. I've taken inspiration from what first on the surface might seem like an unlikely source, an author who says in this paper that his theory just doesn't apply to science at all. This doesn't seem like a promising place to start for modeling scientific concepts, but I'm going to try and convince you otherwise. So this paper, if you can't read it, Essentially Contested Concepts is the name of the paper, published in 1956 by W.B. Gallie. So he's a Scottish philosopher, worked in a number of different UK countries and settled down at Cambridge at the end of his career. His work on historical explanation has gotten a little bit of traction lately in philosophy of science. I've seen it kind of cited in a couple of talks, but he's much more likely to be known to political philosophers because of this paper, which has been really widely discussed. It's got like 6,000 citations on Google Scholar, and Gallie considered it his most important contribution himself. So in the paper, he targets concepts that are really important to human communities, but that are difficult to analyze philosophically. So his key examples that he explores here are the political concept of democracy, the aesthetic concept of art, and the religious concept of a Christian life. And so for all of these concepts, he's using this account to try and thread a path between essentialism, saying there's just one thing that it means to be any of these things, and relativism, just anything goes, right? Like art is whatever you say it is. So I became aware of this through an early draft of Maria Kronfeldner's book on human nature. I know Peter Godfrey Smith also has a paper in which he suggests there might be some affinity between this account and causation, but otherwise I'm not aware of discussion of this much in philosophy of science. And I'm hoping to stimulate more of that discussion. Okay, so let's dive into Gallie. Here is how he puts this problem that he's trying to deal with these concepts. So he's observing that there are some conceptual disputes over the meaning of things like democracy or art that seem not to be resolvable by argument of any kind. And specifically, he says there's no agreed criterion among the people who are having this argument for determining the proper use of concept. There's not like some set of criteria out there that we can all agree this is what it means to be art. Side note, this is why he thinks, a large part of why he thinks it doesn't apply to science. He thinks there are such criteria in the case of science. And yet, even though you can't settle the concept through the meaning of the concept through argument, the debate still involves arguments and evidence. People are making cases, reasoned cases for why one use of democracy or art is better than another, or why this thing is a better democracy or better art than others. So it's not just like a simple matter of taste, like I like chocolate ice cream and you prefer vanilla, and we can't really have an argument. Like there's something rational going on here. So he concludes, looking at this, that there might be certain cases in which conflict over the use of the term is constitutive of what it means to use the concept properly. So there are concepts, the proper use of which, he says, generates disputes about their proper uses. So to make that intuition more precise, he proposes what he calls a single explanatory hypothesis, calling for some fairly rigid schematization. So in other words, he's going to give a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for a concept to become essentially contested. And he thinks when these conditions are met, we have an explanation of the ongoing conflict. So what I'll do next is briefly explain the schema. There's kind of 7 conditions, and it's a little important to see how they all fit together. And I'll also give this artificial example that Gallie uses to make the conditions clearer. Then I'm going to make a case for why he was wrong about the relevance of this account for science, with some suitable modifications. So especially I'm going to get rid of the necessary and sufficient condition part. It's actually very promising, I think, for explaining why polysemy is so pervasive and often quite fruitful. All right, so first we get this set of 4 necessary conditions for something to become essentially contested. The first one, which seems kind of like a prerequisite for Gallie, is that the concept needs to signify or accredit some kind of valued achievement. Okay, signify or accredit. So by calling something a work of art, we're not only referring to it, but we're like, this picture somewhere is art. But there's a lot of art over on the shelves there. I will refer you to that. But we're also marking it as valuable, right? We're saying like there's something valuable having this art around in the world. I think this or here should really be an and. It sort of both signifies, points to the art, and at the same time says it's valuable. So I'm just going to change it to and moving forward. Both of these things are going on when we're using a concept term like art. Okay. So Gallie is especially interested in one particular consequence of this accrediting of something as an achievement, which is that other people will often want to develop or build on the achievement rather than just sitting back and admiring it, right? So lots of people want to make art or contribute to the advancement of democracy rather than just sort of enjoying that these things exist in the world. Okay. The next sort of set of conditions is that there are certain features of this valued achievement that generate differences among users who try and do that development in the future. So the achievement has these certain features. It's internally complex, so it has many different properties involved in the achievement. There's skills of many kinds involved in making art. So it can be described in a number of different ways. And then also its future development as circumstances change is open and impossible to predict in advance. So the democracy example might work well here. Various future conditions about the world or about the country are going to press on the democracy in various kinds of ways. It's very difficult to predict how you're going to have to change what you mean by democracy in response. Okay, so here's our artificial example. Here's some art. We can use that as an example. It's a little hard to see, but I think it'll work for my purposes. So Gallie asks us to imagine something like the pub game known as Skittles. So the game's very old. Here it's being played outside an inn in 17th century Holland. And it always involves bowling. So that's the key thing that's going on down there in the corner. Whoops. Okay. Trying to highlight the bowling that's going on there. You can see the pins and that person's holding a ball. But the rules and the equipment sort of vary regionally. So the concept that he asks us to focus on to sort of understand what he's getting at is the concept of champion. So who is playing this game the best? So he adds a few conditions to the game to show how we might get an essentially contested concept in this case. So the competition is going to be continuous. There's no Super Bowl of Skittles that sort of determines the championship once and for all for the next year. The teams are going to specialize in different styles or methods or strategies of play. So just run with me for the sake of argument here. Let's imagine that each of these fellows here represent different teams and they kind of specialize in different features of the game of Skittles. So Peter there is really into having perfect aim. We have sheer speed Sam, who's all about rolling the ball really fast, and optimal spin Oscar, getting the ball just have like that special spin that can navigate over the different terrains. So all of those things, aim, speed, spin, have to be involved in bowling. You can't bowl without aim or without speed or without spin, but you could choose to focus on them in sort of different ways to different extents in different teams. So there's no official scoring in this game or judges, but the championship is kind of acclaimed by the supporters, by the fans. So like this little guy here with the red hat and these people relaxing on the hillside. They are the ones who are going to determine who the champions are. So effectively, the champion is the one with the strongest support, but that doesn't sort of quiet the losers, so to speak. They continue to defend their team as the true champions, right? So like, oh, these people shouted louder, but really our team is really showing you what it means to play Skittles. Okay, so this is sort of hopefully starts to make this a little more concrete. So those are the first 4 conditions. Then we get a 5th condition that Gallie says sort of completes this set of formal definition conditions. So presumably all of these 5 things together are supposed to be necessary and sufficient for essential contestedness. And this is just this idea of reciprocal recognition. So the teams recognize that they are competing with one another for the true meaning of championship. When I use it in a certain way to emphasize my amazing skills of spin, I recognize that I'm sort of trying to head off the other people who want to be seen as champions. Okay, so then Gallie makes an interesting move. He claims that those 5 conditions are definitive of an essentially contested concept, but he anticipates a critic objecting that what we have here is not really a productive debate over a single concept, but instead a pointless argument over what he says, quote, a term which in fact serves simply to confuse different concepts about whose proper application no one need have contested at all. Okay, so this sounds a lot like the objections of eliminativists that we were talking about earlier in the talk. Why do we keep saying that we've got one concept here with multiple meanings? Don't we just have multiple concepts that are confused under the heading of a single term? So he sort of sums this up. Is there any real ground for maintaining that this concept has a single meaning that could be contested? Is there anything that we are contesting over time? And the answer is basically going to be that all of the contestants are playing the same game, literally in the case of the champion, but metaphorically in the case of other concepts. He's going to give us these justifications for continued use that spell out what it means to actually be playing the same game. So here, the first one is really important. This is going to be the focus of the 3rd section of the talk. The different contestants all derive their usage from some sort of exemplar of the achievement in question. And that exemplar that really embodies the achievement is going to be, that achievement itself is going to be advanced by the competition over it. So again, returning to our artificial example, I covered this old fellow up before, but imagine that's Skittles Scott. He is sort of the person that brought the game of Skittles to this town. He is the exemplar of Skittles playing for this 17th century village. He trained up the first team, and all these other teams here are trying to carry on the legacy of Skittles mastery that is inaugurated by Skittles Scott. But of course, they're doing it in different ways by focusing on different skills. They have to adapt to different conditions as they travel to other villages. And this is important. So we could presume that the overall level of regional Skittles play has actually improved as a result of their competition, right? So the fact that, people are trying to develop spin versus speed versus aim, all these other things, is actually improved the level of Skittles play. And Scott can be proud of his original achievement. Okay, so everyone is playing at the same game in some sense. It's important that they are all competing for the same championship. Okay. So much for the schema. Kind of zooming out here before we dive into scientific concepts, I want to observe that it has a nice feature that I think makes it promising, something that kind of attracted me to the model in the first place, which is that we see a balance kind of on these 2 sides of the schema here between things that tend to lead to fragmentation or diversification. So these sort of features in the box, the internal complexity, the various describability, the openness, those things are going to tend to drive different uses of the concept apart. But on the other side, we have these things that tend to generate cohesion, the ongoing attempt to develop the exemplar. And this balance between things that drive meanings apart and things that in some sense hold them together, I think is going to be really, finding some balance like that is going to be important for any general account of what's going on with scientific concepts. Okay, so alas, oops, sorry. Okay, there are a few hurdles for scientific concepts. I gave it away. The first one is that this necessary and sufficient condition schema is kind of problematic, I think. We don't want to sort of replace debates over the proper meaning of homology or species with debates over what exactly counts as an essentially contested concept, right? So I don't want to have it be so rigid. So as I already hinted, I brought my philosophical transmogrifier to Pittsburgh with me so I can easily transform this schema into a flexible model. You can turn it into, it allows you to turn something into anything at all, right? So the dial there, instead of eels and baboons and bugs, I've just replaced them, schema, model. We'll take a schema, put it in, we'll get out a model. It's going to be great. Okay, so, and I'll say, I'm not just going to do this. I'll say a little bit more about what I'm actually going to do in a second. So that's the first hurdle, right? We don't want this rigid schema. The second hurdle is that I think Gallie's account kind of overemphasizes conflict. So he's interested in cases where there's argument, but we don't have to have arguments. We can have differences that don't necessarily lead to conflict. And that seems important. So I'm going to suggest that we're looking for something like the following category. So this was my original title, essentially dynamic concepts, which I'm going to suggest are concepts, the proper use of which naturally generate change in their proper use. So as you continue to use the concept well, you're going to get change, you're going to get diversification over time. But again, this is part of a modeling framework. It's going to be flexible. So I don't want to say every scientific concept is essentially dynamic, right? It's just the sort of ones that I'm most interested in for this project are going to be those where the model, the different factors we're looking at line up to produce essentially dynamic behavior. Okay, and then the last hurdle is Gallie's own assumption that the model is inappropriate for scientific concepts. So that's the part I'm going to focus on next. There's kind of three issues here, as I said here. So can scientific terms be appraisive? Like, are they achievement words? Does it make sense to talk about them in that way that we do for things like democracy and art? If so, can the corresponding achievements be internally complex, variously describable, and open? And if so, can those achievements have exemplars? Okay, so yes, I want to say, not surprisingly, scientific concepts, scientific terms are achievement words, at least some of the time. There's a weak sense here in that classification is always going to be an appraisive activity. We're valuing some things and not others when we classify. But I don't just mean here that classifications reflect our values, they obviously do, but also that having a classification is necessary to get some research problem off the ground. So when we decide to call something a function or a homolog or a species or any of these things, we're sort of designated as worthy of study among all of the other things that are out there that we could possibly study in the world. So that's what I mean by the weak sense. Classification is just appraisive. And then I think on top of that sort of basic value that we have in making a classification and picking some things out for study, some categories probably have properties that make them especially valuable to communities of researchers. And I'm still thinking about this part, so I'd love feedback on these, but here are some suggestions, some possibilities that I see of what might make a category designated by a term and a concept especially valuable. So it might be sort of fundamental in some sense to ongoing research activity. So I see people in the homology literature saying things, this is the scientist, saying things like homology is the central concept for all of biology, right? They don't necessarily mean every biologist is constantly talking about homology, but there's something about that relationship that is really important for a lot of other things that biologists do. Maybe the concept is instrumental to some sort of technological or remunerative aim. So gene obviously has lots of technological applications which can earn money, right? Some concepts might be particularly distinctive of particular groups or schools of thought. So using a concept in a particular way might be sort of like a bumper sticker for a group of scientists, right? Like this is the way I approach concept or function or gene or homology or whatever. And that can have its own purpose for coordinating scientific activity. And then some things a little bit vague, but like fruitfulness, certain concepts seem to be just especially good veins in which to work, where you're studying things like homology, lots of new and interesting research problems continue to come from them. So these kinds of things, I think, are what we are going to be looking for in these concepts that are going to be subject to these dynamics. All right. Let's move on to the second point about complexity. Can the corresponding achievements, if in fact I'm right about this appraisive function, can they be internally complex, variously describable, and open? I think yes, they definitely can. I think there's two. I think complexity is kind of the root here. When something is complex, having different properties, then it becomes variously describable and is especially likely to be open. So I'm going to focus on two forms of complexity that I think are major in science. One kind of comes from nature and one comes from the way we do science. So the thing that comes from nature is just what we might loosely call spatiotemporally complex spatiotemporal complexity. So natural systems that we study and that we use our concepts to study just often are complex physical objects. Lots of sciences have subdisciplines that focus on different scales of space and time, but sometimes concepts cross those scales. In biology, we have this notion of levels of organization, which is kind of, some of these things here might be categorized as levels of organization. And for the sort of argument about complexity to go through, I don't need there to be any absolute levels in any metaphysical sense. There's kind of a debate in philosophy of biology about levels of organization and how we understand those. I think I can be neutral about this. Like there doesn't have to be like one level picture in the world. It just has to be the case that our concepts capture multiple different sort of spatio-temporal regions at different scales, and interesting things that we care about are happening at those scales. Okay, so that's the complexity that comes from nature. It's also the case that science itself is what I'm going to call epistemically complex, and the concepts are going to reflect that fact. So this is the best representation I've found so far, this kind of colorful, fuzzy-edged blob of what's going on in concept use. And I want the boundaries to be fuzzy, in part because I'm including in it things that have traditionally been understood as the content of the concept, right? So like, what does it mean and to what does it refer? Those are sort of part of the blob of concept use. But then there's also stuff in here that's traditionally been separated and treated not as meaning, but as use. So techniques that the concept's associated with, data that it helps to generate. I think for the purpose of what for setting up kind of the features that we want to look for in an exemplar, it's important to be as inclusive as we can in thinking about like what features of the achievement, what things are being done with the concept that are going to make other scientists sit up and take notice and continue to work in that vein. I also want to point out just that there's complexity within some of these categories here. So like definitions, for instance, can be very theoretical and explanatory, or they can be very pragmatic and operational. So even there's complexity upon complexity in our sort of epistemic landscape for concepts. Okay, last thing to address here is exemplary achievement. That's the focus of the next part of the talk, so I won't say much more about it right this second. But now I want to go back to the model and give you something a little bit better than the transmogrification cartoon that I had earlier. So this is how I understand the transformation from this formal schema to this more dynamic concept. So this apprasive feature is kind of like a background condition. And to the degree that the concept is apprasive, it might be more or less apprasive, more or less strongly valuing of things that are relevant for scientists. Maybe the more strong these dynamics are going to be that I will add next. So I think it helps to sort of group the different things we've talked about so far into diversifying factors and cohesive factors. So these things might independently vary. That's something for further study. So to the extent that a concept has a clear exemplar that that is shaping future practice, there's going to be more cohesion among the different meanings. To the extent that it's very complex, very open, changing a lot, there's going to be more diversification going on. The other change that I'll flag from Gallie here is instead of advanced by competition under the cohesive box there, I've changed it to advanced by diversity. So again, there just needs to be different scientists pursuing the achievement in different ways. And sometimes they may be arguing and competing over it, but they might just be doing different things. So these cohesive and diversifying factors are going to kind of operate together in some way and produce these outcomes of reciprocal recognition among various users. Again, that could be harmonious or conflicted, conceptual change, and ultimately semantic variation. So this is my updated, more flexible version of Gallie's schema for scientific concepts. All right, now on to part 3, exemplarity, this key component of the model that I want to focus on a bit more. I think this is especially important. I've kind of already hinted at this, but what it promises to do is address sort of a common challenge that people have wrestled with in the literature, which I already mentioned in the case of Gallie, which is there sort of what holds the different meanings of some concepts together or the different meanings of a term together? Is there any real ground for maintaining that we've got some single meaning here that is variable or contested? So just to give 2 examples, one from the functions literature, one from the homology literature, we have people asking very similar versions of this question in a specific way. what reason do we have to use function to talk both about etiological accounts, like how the function came to be, and causal role functions, what purpose it's serving in a broader system? Is there anything in common? And Godfrey Smith here is going to say, no, these are separate. We should keep them apart. Novick, in the case of homology, is going to say that actually there is kind of a patchwork structure that holds together these different accounts, and that's what makes them both accounts of homology. So I'm just put these quotes up here to emphasize that this is a problem the exemplar is trying to address that's been recognized and is out there in the literature. So what distinguishes this approach, this idea of using exemplarity for cohesion? So I've already mentioned the historical nature of the account, and I think that's kind of the starting point for what's really distinctive. So in a lot of other patchwork or integrative accounts, I think the cohesion is typically provided by some feature that is either timeless or that sort of holds during a fairly narrow time slice around when the philosopher is observing the debate. So sometimes the relationship is kind of a quasi-metaphysical relationship, like there's different aspects of some complex process in nature and our different varieties, different variants of the concept, different flavors are picking out different aspects of that process. That would be kind of one sort of timeless relationship. There's often also kind of maybe an epistemic relationship between different kinds of accounts. So in Novick's account of homology, there's sort of like a general abstract picture that gets filled in with mechanistic details. That's kind of an epistemic relationship, or maybe a pragmatic requirement in the Cusimano and Stirner's integrated pluralism. The different varieties need to cooperate in some task, like explanation or problem specification. So those are all either, like I said, kind of timeless or focused on the horizon of the present. And I think what is unusual about the model I'm trying to develop is that the glue is primarily historical. So the different users of the concept are bound together by their participation in this ongoing line of research, this attempt to work in the same vein of science, to play the same game, to develop the same line of research and advance the same achievement in some sense. This is a little bit difficult to specify precisely, so something, again, I'd be happy to have feedback on. I'm still working it out. But I do want to say the kind of cohesion that I have in mind here is meant to be a bit thicker than just like academic pedigree or genealogy, like we all, read the same books or worked with the same people or something like that. It doesn't really matter so much how the researchers came to use the concept or who they learned it from. It's more about the kind of common aim, the common project that they're engaged with, something a little bit thicker. So the best image I have right now is kind of tilling the same ground as previous workers. Everything from the terrain that you have to work with, the seeds in the ground, the tools in the shed, that's all going to depend on the achievement of the other people who came before. But I'd love ideas on how to make that more precise. I do also want to forestall a few potential confusions about exemplars. So the key feature of the exemplar, this is a quote from Gallie here, is that it has a certain authority for subsequent users of the concept. This doesn't mean, though, this is important, that the exemplar is uniformly endorsed and universally endorsed by all participants. So you can have authority without having sort of unquestioning imitation or obedience in a sense. And I think this follows from the open character of the concept, right? The point is to maintain the achievement and to develop it and advance it as circumstances change, not to just do exactly what was done before. So again, to use one of Gallie's example, a healthy democracy needs to take account of its failures to live up to its own ideals. That's recognizing the authority of certain ideals that we had in the past, but also recognizing that we didn't live up to them. We need to criticize, we need to correct, change something about our democracy to make it work better. So the second thing that's important to say is that as Gallie is applying his account to real cases, he makes it clear that the exemplar, as he understands it, can be fairly loosely circumscribed. So in the artificial example, I had our one Skittle Sam and his teammates, right? Like the one person who's an archetype, not an archetype, so an exemplar, excuse me. But in the case of democracy, again, and in art, he appeals to sort of these long traditions of exemplars. He says maybe there's historically independent but similar traditions of art or of anti-inegalitarian action in the case of democracy. And I think this kind of slightly more relaxed stance seems important for science as well, given that there's close connections historically between successive stages of work with any given concept. So it might be, I'm envisioning exemplars being potentially like a group, they could very easily be a group of researchers working with a particular concept at a particular point in time. And there may not be a sharp boundary of who counts as in and out. You can sort of gesture to this school of people or this body of work without it having to be precisely and sharply circumscribed. So that's the second bullet point there. The last correction that I need to make is that, or potential confusion to forestall, is that there's no abstract core or essence of the concept. Otherwise, that could obviously serve as the standard for settling the disputes among users. So sometimes people have misunderstood this approach to say that there has to be some abstract core that everyone can agree counts as democracy or whatever. But that's the point, that people don't agree about those things. All right, so the next stage of the talk, I'm going to go through some examples for the concept of homology. I'm going to have to do that a little quicker than I expected, but let me sum up before I do that what I think we should be looking for as we survey this case and as we look for other cases. So when we're looking for scientific exemplars, I think we should be looking for broad acknowledgement of authority in a community of use, right? So generally speaking, people are going to acknowledge that this body of work, this way of using the concept is authoritative and worth developing. We're going to be looking for some sort of coordination of epistemically complex resources. So the concept somehow is sort of like a meeting point or coordination point for the different resources for different methods, tools, definitions, ideas, examples. The concept should also be used to engage with spatiotemporally complex phenomena. So ones that kind of cross these scales of space and time are going to be the ones that where we see the most diversification. And then in order for the exemplar to be an exemplar of the original achievement, it needs to be pursuing the original achievement in some way. This is also something that I think needs a bit more specification. It's a little tricky to figure out how to make explicit what that feature is that makes it such that somebody doing a particular research project is pursuing the same achievement as some other person at a different point in time. But here are some features that we might see. You might see explicit acknowledgement, like I am developing so-and-so's concept of such and such, like sometimes that does happen. Kind of popular acclaim, so a group might recognize, oh, this person's work is really important for shifting the debate over homology, for instance, regardless of what that person themselves said. There might actually be some sort of genealogical relationship, like we can trace back through different researchers the uses, or some other metric of similarity I haven't come up with yet. So in any case, all of these things are in play to some extent in the case that I want to consider, the homology case. So I'll try and highlight those as I go. Okay. So I'm going to go kind of briefly through the stuff about homology. Apologies to people for whom the concept is new, but I just want to give you a flavor of what it might look like concretely to be talking about exemplars. So the easiest way to define what homology is, so roughly it's the relationship that unites the same part and distinct organisms. Examples are really good for doing this, right? So here are a whole bunch of different limbs that have the same bones and the same relative connections, but they're used in a lot of different ways in the animals. Yeah, you can see the outlines there. Here we have an atlas moth, which has sort of regular four wings and hind wings. And then in that same four-wing position, we've got some very modified organisms. So in this case, these little things are called elytra. There's these hard casings that are used to protect the wings. And here we've got, they're a little hard to see, but these little tiny balancing organisms called halteres. So those are four wings. These are the same part in some sense as the regular four wings. They're homologous. Just so the plants don't feel left out, here we have a whole bunch of examples of crazily modified leaves, right? So when I say leaf, you probably think something kind of green, maybe it grows on a tree, but all of these things here are leaves, just modified in various kinds of ways. One more little twist we need to add to understand the concept is that I've been talking in this kind of shorthand way, is this thing homologous to that thing? But the question is actually a bit incomplete, as people have come to recognize. We can't just say, are these wings homologous? We need to say kind of in virtue of what kind of part are we asking about the sameness of? So put it another way, homologous is a three-place relation or three-place predicate, right? So these things are homologous as forelimbs, but they're not homologous as wings. So there's some extra things we need to consider we need to be comparing the parts. They have to be the same part in this case. And here that sameness is being determined genealogically. There's an ancestral tetrapod that has a certain bone structure. Bats and birds are both related to that ancestor, but the wings are sort of independently derived over evolutionary time. Okay. So quick crash course on homology. All right, given examples, what is it? When we start to get into verbal definitions, it gets a lot messier. So here is Richard Owen, one of the exemplars I'm going to be talking about, who just says it's the same organ under every variety of form and function. And lots of ink has been spilled trying to make more precise what exactly that sameness is. If it can persist even when the shape of the organism changes, the organ changes, the function changes. If you ask present day biologists, you don't get any clearer. I'm not going to talk about all these definitions, but the point is just to see there's a whole lot of different approaches that people take. There's a lot of other concepts that get invoked in defining homology and a lot of different directions you can go. So, I mean, a common approach that I think is taken in the philosophical literature is to sort of sift these definitions and say, okay, sure, there's, 50 different definitions, but they kind of break down into these different categories. We can kind of figure out what the foundation of each category is, and then you take those slightly abstracted categories and figure out how they should fit together. That's not the approach that I'm trying to take here. Instead, I want to go back to that historical perspective and look at kind of what are key moments in the development of the concept over time, key achievements that are recognized by the community that shape its future practice. So again, these are the things we're looking for: authority, complexity, and pursuit of the original achievement. So there's sort of 3 exemplars that I want to recognize in the case of homology. I'll just ask you to take it on trust that they're recognized as having authority by the community, and I'll focus briefly on some of the other features, the complexity and the achievement. 3 figures associated with the exemplary research programs are Richard Owen, sort of the figure in 19th century British comparative anatomy before Darwin; Willy Hennig, whose work is insect systematist, so his work transformed the practice of biological classification; and then Günter Wagner, who continues to be a major figure in evolutionary developmental biology. And I mean, I put up the pictures because it makes it easier to sort of visualize what's going on, but I want to be careful because when we put like the pictures in the names and say like these represent the exemplars, it kind of suggests that like the people are the exemplars, or somehow that they single-handedly transformed the concept by themselves, which is very much not the case, right? That would be an exaggeration. That sort of I definitely don't want to say the people are the exemplars. I do want to say something about their research is exemplary, but again, they're not doing that single-handedly. Certainly there's something importantly novel that each of them has done with the concept, and you can kind of recognize that if you step back in time. But part of that novelty lies in synthesizing and developing existing ideas in a particularly clear and fruitful fashion. And so if you actually read their work, you can see that. They can say, all right, there's all of these inspirations for this thing called homology. In the case of Richard Owen, I'm going to pull it out, pull those things together, define them really clearly. Likewise, with Wagner in particular, he's saying, okay, there's certain strands in the study of homology that have been neglected. I'm going to sort of synthesize them and develop my own account. So major caveat to putting the names and the faces up here, but they are a convenient way of talking about it. Okay, so as I said before, concept use is epistemically complex. There are a lot of different features involved in any particular achievement. I'm going to focus, as I briefly say something about these different figures, on their theoretical explanations, but each of them is contributing in all these other ways as well. So Owen, I've already mentioned, he's kind of the exemplar. What he's trying to do in his work is distinguish the homology relationship and ground it in this vertebrate archetype. And so he's trying to distinguish the homology relationship from other kinds of relationships that people have identified before in comparative anatomy. The vertebrate archetype is kind of this very metaphysically complicated thing. It sometimes sounds like it's a bit historical. Sometimes it sounds like it's this abstract divine idea, and he really struggles with it. And basically it gets, as I said before, so sometimes it can be very concrete. Here's a picture of the archetype. It looks kind of like this simple marine organism. But basically homology is understood by correspondence between actually existing organisms and this archetype, which doesn't exist really, but again, I won't go into the details of it. So you could probably see where this is going. Oh, so limb example, also really important. Owen studies limbs. Part of the reason why we talk about limbs when we talk about homology is because of him. Okay, where this is going is sort of this Darwinian transformation that happens almost immediately after Owen develops his theory. So this sort of basically confusing, complicated notion of an archetype gets replaced by this sort of comfortingly historical ancestor, right? We can, instead of derivation of these parts from an archetype, we can derive them from an ancestor over historical time. But something that's curious about Owen, and which I think testifies to the nature of the achievement, is that people don't stop talking about Owen's homology. It's not like they abandon it and totally rework the framework, right? The definition, the theory changes really dramatically, but a lot of the other stuff basically stays the same. A lot of these other epistemically complex things continue to happen. People study the same phenomena, they identify them in the same way, they look at the same methods, and so on and so forth. Okay. Okay, Hennig, very briefly, is an unintentional exemplar. So now we're jumping forward about 100 years. His theoretical project is, unlike the other two that I'm talking about, not centered on homology at all. He's not saying I have a homology research project in the way that Owen and Wagner do. He's instead got this project of systematics, trying to rework a reference framework for all of biology. There's a whole bunch of methods and key terms that are used here. I'm not going to go into the details for the sake of time. I think I'll skip this too, but I can talk more about it if people are interested. The key thing to know about this is that what Hennig wants to do is recast relationships, recast biological classifications in terms of relationships of descent and in terms of the order of branching events that happen over time. So he invents a bunch of new concepts that help do this, and they are related to homology in interesting and complicated ways, and generate large debates in the systematics community among Hennig's followers over precisely how all the concepts are related to homology, which one of his concepts should be identified with homology, whether or not they should be. So you get people that agree on a whole lot. They agree that Hennig has shown us the way to do systematics. They agree that these concepts are really, really useful in systematics, but they disagree on how they're related to homology. And I think that's something that shows you sort of the exemplary achievement that's going on here. Okay, so Wagner, who is working explicitly on homology, is kind of, it's a little early to say, he's still very active, but I think perhaps an exemplar in the making. So his theoretical project is to understand how body parts are developmentally individuated as units of evolutionary change. So remember I said that it's important not just to say, are these things homologous, but are they homologous as a wing or as a leg or as, a leaf or some other kind of part. That question of what makes something a leaf, what makes it a wing, what makes it a limb such that it could have all these varieties, that's the question that's trying to get answered here. What is the nature of body part identity, given that homology is supposed to be this thing that persists in the midst of a whole lot of change? So he's got a whole series of conceptualizations of specifying this homology relationship in a very different way than it had been specified before, not in a historical sense, but in a more mechanistic sense, though with a historical background. Lots of methods, lots of data, lots of examples. Here's just little diagram to show what's going on here. So the character identity concept is, these are supposed to be particular genetic networks that are determined, that are less flexible in evolutionary time, and that help determine what it means for a part to be a certain kind of part, and that's how it can be homologous. So homologs would share this character identity network. All the different limbs would have some particular set of genes in this character identity network that would cause limbs to grow, but then there would be other signals interacting with those character identity networks that make the differences that we see between the bat wing and the bird wing, and so on and so forth. All right. So what do these programs have in common? Summing those up, there's these traits of exemplarity that I've mentioned before. There's broad acknowledgement of authority in a use community. There's these different epistemically complex resources. So I've kind of highlighted the theoretical perspective that each of these people has, but they're doing a lot of other things. They're generating data, they're coming up with examples, different criteria for how we can apply homology. And all of the phenomena involved are pretty spatiotemporally complex. So the limb is one that's persisted from Owen all the way down to Wagner. You can look at limbs just looking at their gross anatomy. You can sequence the genes that are involved in making limbs, and you can figure out which genes are being expressed at which points in time. So there's a lot of richness there to exploit. And this is the best I can do in summing up the common achievement that they have. They have this shared interest in sifting out the biologically meaningful forms of resemblance. So there's lots of resemblances that we might notice. Some seem to be biologically more illuminating than others. There's the same but differentness that we have in homology, and that's what that's the furrow in which they are all working biologically. So again, just to bring this part of the talk to a close, here's the model, this appraisive concept, these cohesive and diversifying factors that are interacting to produce an outcome, and a few virtues of the model that I think can be developed. So I think once you have a model structure, there's a kind of heuristic guidance that happens. We have questions about which components are most prominent in various cases. And that helps us to start to identify patterns that happen over time. For instance, the pattern of starting with gross anatomy and then focusing on mechanisms, or starting with high level observations and then trying to get down in the causal details. I think that probably happens a lot in different cases. So once we have a model, we can start to ask those questions. I think the model can also be somewhat explanatory. It can help us understand why certain cases turned out the way that they did. So maybe the diversifying factors were strong, or the cohesive factors were strong, or they were balanced. I think it's modestly normative. So I don't want to be very prescriptive in scientific usage. That's probably been clear from what I've said, but I do want to be able to ask questions about how and when does the semantic variation or the polysemy support scientific development? When does it get in the way? How can we sort of sift those cases out? Okay. Kuhnian coda. I did not leave myself much time at all. So what I'm just going to do is put up one suggestive passage here and see if it sparks any conversation. So here's my father's dog-eared copy of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions from the 80s, and then the one that I use while teaching. And I didn't want to think about Kuhn at all when doing this project, but when I started presenting it to other audiences that had people who were not philosophers of science, they kept asking me questions about Kuhn. And then for 2 fall semesters in a row, I happened to be teaching the book while I was working on some part of this concept, of this project. And there were resemblances that I couldn't ignore. And I don't know what to make of them. I'd love to hear if anyone has ideas. This is the opening sentence of the second section of Structure, where Kuhn introduces this concept of normal science. So he says, normal science is research firmly based on one or more past achievements that some particular scientific community acknowledges for a time as supplying the foundation for the further practice. This achievement word really jumped out at me after thinking about Gallie for a long time. Something about the achievement is shaping the future practice, but not constraining it. Here he's going to introduce this sort of narrow sense of paradigms as these classic works that are field defining. How do they define a field? 2 qualities that, again, remind me a lot of the things in Gallie's framework. So the achievement is unprecedented. It's sort of valuable. It's novel. It attracts people from other things, but it's also open-ended. So there's still lots of work to be done. And so the question I'll leave with is whether if we sort of whether can we sort of minimize some of the excesses of Kuhn's picture and retain some of the virtues by shifting from paradigm change to conceptual change, thinking about something exemplary that happens not at the level of like paradigms shared by an entire field, but maybe at the level of particular research programs that are using particular concepts. So I'll skip that. Thank you all for your attention, especially with your patience as I went a little bit.
We'll take a 2-minute break and then we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, we tend to our oh, really? Over if I'm there for yeah. No, I'm like, I'll talk to anyone. Let's have conversation.